a big budget, a nicely produced war game that is, I don't know, maybe comparable to films like The Hurt Locker, that have a kind of depth, a kind of tension, and it's not simply about shooting. My issue with mainstream war games is not that they are violent, but it's that they don't really represent, like by no extent, the reality of fighting a contemporary war. So that's to me the main problem. Like, give me a game that is boring, that shows that is boring like a real war, that shows all the I guess the nuances and the kind of like the discomfort of being in a war, in a battlefield. So, for example, like civilians are never there, are always removed. Why not? It's not that you cannot make a game using civilians as a part of essentially the gameplay, and might be just more interesting than just like simply shooting around. So that could be definitely interesting. And in general, one thing that you don't see is an accurate representation of the asymmetrical warfare. Mostly because a lot of shooters are conceived to be played online, and so you cannot really make an asymmetrical kind of game. It will be very strange and very hard to calibrate for an online multiplayer situation. So you always end up with a very abstract ballistic simulation that don't really have anything to do with war in general. Did it make sense?
Yes.
Is that it? Oh, okay. Sorry.
Hi, just want to know the experience of teaching game design at CMU, and if designing serious games is a mandate for students.
It's coming.
If designing serious games is a mandate for students.
Can you shoot you a second?
Serious games.
Yeah, no. The way I teach game design, or it's a course in experimental game design, is I kind of quickly realized that it's impossible to teach game design in a comprehensive way if it's not a game development department, which is my case. I teach in an art school, and so they only have one game related class usually. And so I cannot really cover everything from development to design of every sort of games. And so what I usually do is to focus every semester, focus on one particular aspect. For example, this year we are working on alternative and experimental interfaces, so not really what happens on the screen, but what happens essentially outside the screen, in the modes of interaction and in the devices we use to control and essentially to control games. The year before was more focused on storytelling, and I still have not taught a class specifically dealing with serious games. It's something that I sometimes encourage, but it's definitely not mandatory. Mostly because our students are quite just kind of like engaged and more critical to some extent, more critical than they have a little bit more attitude than probably what a game department will have. So our students are already somewhat used to have a certain critical inquiry And even if it's not political and serious and educational in the strict sense, they generally have an awareness that it's not just they're not here and there to just simply make a fun game or make a potentially commercially successful or viable game.
Okay. Anyone else?
I'm planning to teach a class in serious game maybe next year.
It's the last question.
Still has not happened.
Concerning anti-war games, do you know about the game called Spec Ops: The Line? It is a war game, but it is kind of an anti-war, and its mechanics are slightly repetitive and get boring, and it brings that thing about, it brings civilians into the game and gives us choices to kill civilians or not. So what do you think about that game?
Sure. Give me 1 second.
Yeah.
I was thinking of games that I play for enjoyment, and yes, I do. They're just usually not digital games. Like going back to the first question, they're usually board games. That's something I do really play for enjoyment. And I'm essentially missing local multiplayer games, and whenever I have them, I usually enjoy them more. Okay, so back to this question. The last question, do you know about the game called Spec Ops: The Line? It's kind of an anti-war game with slightly repetitive mechanics and gives you the choices for killing civilians. And now, what do you think about that? No, I have not played Spec Ops: The Line. I've read about it. No, I don't have an opinion on that. If it's a first-person shooter, I just don't really care too much about it. Is it a first-person shooter, right?
Yeah, it's a first-person shooter.
Yeah, I just feel there is a tendency recently, like in the last few years, so there is a since there has been a kind of like a push toward the legitimization of video games as a medium, and now you start seeing many articles and many sort of like commentaries saying, oh, video games should grow up, should become more mature, and so it should become more like movies, more like Hollywood with not just action, but Hollywood, but also with some kind of like exploring some issues and stuff. I noticed that a tendency recently is to sort of like give you the impression that there is a little bit of content, that there is a little bit of moral choice, and the BioShock, the most recent BioShock, and even like the previous episodes of BioShock are kind of like the typical, the epitome of this tendency. BioShock pretends to have to be about the complex history of American slavery and class. But they are not really taking any risks in the sense that the designers admit that what they are trying to make is a Rorschach test, those tests with the blur and like in which you can essentially project your own beliefs. So I guess that's also the solution to how can you make a game that is not propaganda, that is not ideological. Well, you can make a game that is ambiguous enough to essentially mean anything, whatever the player and the viewer wants to see in that, which is kind of like I guess a more sophisticated way to say nothing with a game. I don't know if it makes sense, but yeah, I think I don't know about Spec Ops: The Line, but for what I read, and I did read some reviews, that seems to be the case. I'm making a fairly dumb shooter, and then I kind of like dress it up with a little bit of I guess like moral dilemmas. But I'll have to try that. I'll have to play it. It's hard to say.
That's it. We can't take any more questions. All right, done. Thanks, Paolo, for giving us your time. And yeah, I guess that's it. Yeah. I don't think we can hear.
All right. Thank you, Paolo. We're just disconnected.
All right. Thank you very much, and sorry again for not being there. All right. Good night.
Exploding.